This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Fire in the Lake. Fire in the Lake, the second edition, was released in 2018 by GMT Games and designed by Mark Herman and Volko Ruhnke. The first edition was released in 2014. This game supports up to 4 players and takes about 3 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. I would also like to take a moment for a special thanks to our super supporter, Rob B., also known as Messinuprules over on Board Game Geek. Rob graciously sent me a copy of Fire in the Lake for this breakdown series. Fire in the Lake takes place during the U.S. period of the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1972, ending with the Paris Peace. The game supports 3 scenarios. The short game, Westie's War, from 1965 to 1967, the medium game, A Better War, from 1968 to 1972, and the long game, Nam, from 1964 to 1972. During this time, Vietnam was divided into the Communist North and a Republic in the South. The 2 Vietnams are neighbored by Laos and Cambodia. The Fire in the Lake game board is a roughly zoomed-in version of this map. When playing Fire in the Lake, up to 4 players can assume the role of 4 factions involved in this conflict. 2 insurgent factions, the Communist North Vietnamese Army, also known as the NVA, and their guerrilla allies, the Viet Cong, or VC, operating in South Vietnam. Working together, the insurgents' objective is to reunite South Vietnam with the North under communist rule. However, each insurgent faction also has their own objective that can allow them to win the game over their partner. 2 counterinsurgent factions are trying to prevent this and maintain the Republic in the South. The Republic of Vietnam, abbreviated to ARVN, and the United States, aka the US. The counterinsurgent's objective is to maintain the Republic in South Vietnam. Each counterinsurgent faction also has their own goals, which can allow them to win the game over their ally. The Fire in the Lake game board breaks up the map into spaces. There are 8 cities, represented by circle spaces, and 22 province spaces. Each of these game spaces has an established population expressed by a point system. Each point represents about 500,000 South Vietnamese. Keep in mind, the game's focus is the population of Vietnam, so spaces in Cambodia and Laos will show a population point value of 0. Between cities and provinces, there are 35 population points available in Vietnam. 6 of those population points are in South Vietnam's capital city of Saigon. Each side in the struggle must establish military control over a significant portion of the population and influence that population to either support or oppose the Republic of South Vietnam. Thus, each faction member has a role to play to support their side. On the insurgent side, the NVA are tasked with establishing military control, and the VC are focused on influencing the population to oppose the Republic. Each insurgent faction must also set up their own military bases in the region to bolster their faction. On the counterinsurgent side, ARVN must maintain and grow their level of military control over the population, and the U.S. goal is to influence the population to support the Republic. The counterinsurgent faction's secondary objectives are a little more complicated. ARVN needs to bolster their foreign aid, called patronage, which they use to solidify their hold of the region through bribes. The United States wants to extract themselves from Vietnam and bring their armed forces home. Progress for each faction's goals are monitored using markers on a numbered track, running along the edge of the board. To complete their goals, players manage their faction's strategy on the game board sequence of play area. Fire in the Lake's sequence of play is driven by event cards. During the game's setup, a period-specific deck is prepared for the scenario being played. Then the first two cards are turned over to display for the players. The first card is the active card in play for the current turn. The next card is a preview of the upcoming turn. The top of an event card shows a row of each faction's symbols and establishes the order of play for that turn. Following the order of play, up to 2 factions will take a turn per card. The first faction will then choose either to move their colored cylinder onto the flowchart or pass for the turn. If a faction passes, they move their cylinder to the pass space at the bottom of the eligible factions box and collects resources. They will become eligible to play again on the next turn. The first faction that moves onto the flowchart has 3 options. Each player has a reference card that details their operations and special activities that they can play. The first flowchart space only allows the first faction to play an operation, the second space an operation paired with a special activity, and with the third space, the faction may play an event on the card in play. Card events have 2 options. The non-shaded events often favor the counterinsurgent factions, and the shaded events the insurgent factions. Once the faction decides, they place their cylinder on that space and complete the game action they selected. The second faction that follows onto the flowchart is then forced to take the next space. Some of these spaces only offer limited operations, which means they can only be conducted in one space on the game board. When selecting among these options, players will need to make some tough decisions. A player may want to conduct an operation with a special activity, but if the next eligible faction is an opponent and the current event favors their side, they may need to postpone their plans to block their opponent from playing the event. Instead, they can play an operation only or play the event that favors their side first to prevent this from happening. Once 2 factions have played, their colored cylinders are then moved to the ineligible factions box. Any faction cylinders in the pass space are moved back to the eligible space. The card on deck is moved to the active card in play, and the next card in the deck is flipped over to preview the next turn. The top of the new active card shows the faction symbols for the order of play. When deciding which faction goes next, though, remove the ineligible factions from the order. So in this example, the VC would go next. And when the next 2 factions enter the flowchart, completing that turn, the ineligible factions are moved back to the eligible factions box to make room for the factions that just completed their turn. The preview card is moved to the active card, and the next card in the deck is flipped over. Gameplay will continue through these cards until a coup card appears in the preview. This triggers a monsoon on the current card in play, which limits players' actions. Once the active card with the monsoon is played through, the coup card is brought into play. With coup cards, the current campaign of the war ends. Players will then work through a string of required activities to conduct victory checks, manage game pieces on the board, gather resources, and then reset the board for the next campaign season. Now, this is just a high-level overview of Fire in the Lake. Keep in mind, we're just scratching the surface here to give you an idea of gameplay. Since this is such a complex game, let's begin by learning the fundamental concepts. The requirements for military control of a province or city space, how to influence the population of those spaces, and the resource economics that drive gameplay. Each space, whether it be a city or a province, has a pair of boxes above their population point value. The first box is for influence, the second slightly larger box is for control. Two of the most important game mechanics in Fire in the Lake and other coin games is the concept of military control and population influence. Military control of a city or province is established by having more game pieces in the space than your opponents. Each game piece, no matter which type, counts as 1 point towards control. For Fire in the Lake, there are specific requirements for the insurgents or counterinsurgents to take control. For the insurgents, control can only be established by the NVA. This can be achieved by having more red game pieces than the other 3 factions. Yes, this also includes their allies, the VC. The counterinsurgents, on the other hand, the ARVN and the US, can pool their military resources to achieve coin control of a province or a city space. Once a faction has control, they earn points equal to the space's population. This adjusts their marker on the numbered track wrapping around the game board. And if control of the space is lost, their markers are adjusted for those loss of points. But only the factions that have control as part of their victory conditions. This would be the NVA or ARVN factions. If neither side has the game pieces to establish control, then the space remains uncontrolled. In other words, there's not a marker on it. One of the most interesting aspects of these coin games is the concept of influence. Either side may control a space on the board, but what does the population that live there think about them? The people may support the existing republic or oppose it in favor of the insurgents. This attitude reflects the influence of both factions on the local population. It's measured on a form of political spectrum. If the population doesn't care either way, they're neutral. They may then passively or actively support or oppose the existing Republic of Vietnam, and therefore they may be under the influence of the counterinsurgents or the insurgents. For gameplay purposes, the more a space supports or opposes the current regime, the more influence points that side receives towards their victory condition. Passive support or opposition is 1 times the population in victory points for influence, and active support or opposition is 2 times the population number in victory points for influence. Remember though, only the factions that have influence as part of their victory conditions get these points, which adjusts their marker on the numbered track. On the insurgent side, the Viet Cong tracks influence as a victory condition, and on the counterinsurgent side, the US tracks influence as a victory condition. In Fire in the Lake, there are several opportunities to change the influence of a region or a city, but factions can directly influence a population of a city or a region through their operations. Meeting the required criteria, insurgent factions can conduct terror operations. This will influence a population towards opposing the Republic. And counterinsurgent factions can conduct a training operation and then pacify the population. This will influence them to support the Republic. This is just 2 ways to adjust the population influence. The game offers a lot more opportunities. Along with the concepts of influence and control, the game's economy is yet another important element to master. Most of a faction's operations cost resources to execute. Operations are key gameplay actions that allow players to place and move their forces on the board, as well as remove enemy game pieces and other unique abilities. Each faction's resources are monitored with colored cylinders on the numbered track that runs along the outside edge of the game board. There is one exception though. The US shares ARVN's resources. Therefore, the US does not have their own cylinder for tracking resources, but their expenditures are recorded with a yellow ARVN cylinder. Resources can be earned in a number of ways, but they are regularly collected at the end of a campaign period during the coup phase. This is when each faction is awarded resources based on their current progress in the game. Let's walk through each faction's funding methods to gain a better understanding of the game's economy. The VC are a guerrilla faction and receive funding in the coup phase based on the number of bases they have on the map. They receive 1 point for each base on the map. During a turn, the VC can also conduct a special action with a significant guerrilla presence and no coin control to tax the population. Be aware though, this tactic will shift the population's support back to the Republic. The NVA receives their funding from bases placed on the map with the exception of bases on the North Vietnam space. During the coup phase, the NVA counts their phases and is awarded 1 resource point each. NVA forces are also supported through their government in the north. This is represented by the trail track, which is located on the upper left-hand side of the game board. The trail track functions as an abstracted supply line. The numbered spaces on the trail track indicate the strength of this supply line, and this status can change throughout the game based on several factors. Basically though, the higher the number on the trail track, the less it costs the NVA to move their forces out of neighboring countries like Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam. For the purposes of the game's economy though, during the coup phase, the NVA player is awarded double the trail marker rating in resources. Next, let's cover the counterinsurgent factions. As noted earlier, the US and ARVN share resources, but ARVN is the most complicated in terms of funding. Their resources represent the entire Republic of South Vietnam. Managing their funding is also a victory condition for winning the game and can be used by the other factions to cripple them. Therefore, let's list them all out. During the coup phase, they receive up to 15 resources if all lines of communication are functioning. Lines of communication are the highways and rivers that allow transit across South Vietnam. However, much like the trail, these lines can also be sabotaged by insurgent forces to reduce ARVN's funding. Next, let's take a closer look to better understand how to read these lines on the map. Lines on the map identify not only the borders of countries and provinces, but also may indicate lines of communication. The dashed yellow lines call out the borders between South Vietnam and its neighboring countries of North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The gray dashed lines inside South Vietnam indicate not only province borders, but are often highways that the rules refer to as lines of communication, or LOCs, sometimes called just locks. The second type of lines of communication are the blue lines that stand in for transit on the Mekong River. There is a legend at the bottom of the game board that can help you identify these features. Each of these lines of communication begins and ends with black dots that indicate a town or a city space. The lines between these points carry a resource value in a white bubble. The total resource points that can be earned each campaign period from the ARVN player maintaining their country's lines of communication is 15. This is tracked by the econ marker on the number track. Also be aware though, insurgent forces can conduct terror operations that can sabotage a line of communication and remove these resource points from the ARVN faction. While we will delve into using lines of communication for moving forces in a later episode of this series, for now, study the map and get familiar with them as they provide valuable resources for the ARVN faction. The ARVN faction also receives significant foreign support represented by the aid marker. Each game begins with a set level of foreign aid. The short game begins with 15, which is tracked with its own marker on the number track. Throughout the game, various events and game actions increase or decrease this aid amount that is paid out in the coup phase. Finally, there is the patron marker. Patronage is a victory condition for ARVN. The Republic maintains power in South Vietnam by bribing important officials. However, to build victory points in this area, they must divert foreign aid. ARVN can directly add to their patronage and increase their victory points by successfully completing a govern operation. However, This will lower a population's support in the city or region where it is conducted. There are also several other opportunities to divert resources to gain victory points through patronage. Now, before we move on, some brief notes on the United States' use of resources. While the U.S. uses Arvin resources to fund their own operations, their expenditures are governed by the econ marker. The U.S. may only spend those Arvin resources that exceed the econ marker. Therefore, only the Arvin faction may spend resources at or below the econ marker. Remember, while the Arvin forces are focused on exploiting foreign aid to fund patronage, the U.S. is trying to extract themselves from the Vietnam situation. They're focused on bringing their troops home. This is tracked by the number of troops and bases in the available forces box. The less forces the U.S. deploy to Vietnam, the closer they move towards their victory. The U.S. updates its force deployment during the commitment portion of the coup phase. Now that we have a better understanding of control, influence, and the economics behind the game, we should now have enough context to set up a scenario. Fire in the Lake contains 2 booklets to assist players in learning how to play: the Rules of Play and the Playbook. Obviously, the rules of play cover the rules. The playbook, though, contains various tutorials, tips, and strategies, as well as background and design information on the game. To set up Fire in the Lake, refer to page 26 and 27 in the rulebook, which will give instruction for the 3 scenarios for short, medium, and long games. In this breakdown series, I will be referencing the short scenario. First, let's discuss setting up the event deck. We will need to organize the game's cards. Most of the game's cards will be event cards. There are normal events and capability events. The way to tell the difference is that capability events will have a colored faction bar on the card. This means that if the event is played on the card, it has a lasting effect on gameplay, spanning multiple turns. Leave all normal events and capability events in a pile. We need to separate out 2 additional types of cards. First are the coup cards. These cards will say coup at the top. These cards end a campaign season of gameplay. The second group of cards to remove are called pivotal event cards. These are powerful event cards that are not included in the event deck. They're kept in the player's available space, but we won't even need them for the short scenario. Now that we have all the regular event cards and capability event cards separated out, we need to organize them by year. The year can be found in the upper left-hand corner of each card. There are cards for 1964, 1965, and 1968. These 3 sets span the entire time period of the game. Now the next part is a little tricky. You would assume that the short game might start in 1964, but it does not. The short game, titled Westie's War, spans 1965 to 1967, so you're going to use the 1965 cards. The 1964 cards are used for the full game. If you're playing the medium game, you use the 1968 cards. The full game uses all 3 year sets. Also keep in mind, you will not be using all the cards in each year set, so each game could offer different sets of events. Before we do anything, find the AAA capability event, place it and its marker on the game board. The short game begins with this capability already in effect. This is actually a 1964 card, so you're going to need to look in that stack. Now, let's focus in on our 1965 event cards. There should be 48 of these. First, shuffle this deck to randomize the cards, and then deal out 3 piles of 8 cards each. The cards left over can be returned to the game box. Next, bring in the coup cards. There are 6 of these. Take the coup card titled Nguyen Khan and Young Turks and place them on the game board as shown. The Young Turks card is stacked on top. Since the short game takes place 1 year into the war, 2 coups have already happened. Next, we're going to remove one of the failed coup cards from play. Just take one of them and remove them from the game. The 3 remaining coup cards are randomized, and then one is placed in each of the 3 card piles. In the next step, shuffle each pile. This will randomize the coup cards. Then stack each of those piles on top of each other to form the deck. The event deck is ready, and we can now proceed to the next part of setup. The next step of setup, you'll be placing the game markers. Most of these markers will be placed on the number track wrapping around the game board. Then you will place the game pieces on each province and city. The rulebook provides a visual guide for what each of these game pieces look like. When the short scenario is set up, it should look something like this. And now that we have the game set up, this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we will go deeper into the rules for the game. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel, ring the bell icon for notifications so you'll know when the next episode for this series is available. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.